Welcome back, dear listeners, to another episode of Boring History. I'm your host, and tonight we're embarking on a journey that might just make you appreciate your warm bed a little more deeply. We're going to shadow a 14th century English peasant through one complete day, from dawn to dusk and beyond, to understand exactly why most of us wouldn't survive a single week in medieval times. So settle in, pull those covers up, and let your breathing slow. If you drift off during our tale, that's perfectly fine. In fact, it's encouraged. The rhythms of medieval life had their own gentle cadence, and there's something oddly soothing about stepping back 7 centuries to a world where time moved differently. Tonight, we're not talking about kings or battles or grand political machinations. We're talking about survival. Pure, simple, daily survival. The kind that required every ounce of energy, every scrap of knowledge, and every moment of daylight just to see another sunrise. By the end of our time together, you'll understand why your ancestors would consider your life nothing short of miraculous. The year is 1347, and we're in a small village somewhere in the English countryside. Perhaps it's in Yorkshire, or maybe the Cotswolds. The exact location doesn't matter much. What matters is that it's a world away from anything you know, yet populated by people who were fundamentally just like you. They laughed, they loved, they worried about their children, they gossiped about their neighbors. They just did it all while fighting for survival in ways that would break most of us within days. Our protagonist is Thomas. He's 28 years old, which makes him practically middle-aged in his world. He's a villain, bound to the manor, neither free nor quite a slave. He has a wife, Agnes, and 2 surviving children. I say surviving because they've lost 3 others to various ailments that wouldn't even require a doctor's visit today. This isn't unusual. This is just life. So let's begin. Let's step into Thomas's world and see what one day looks like when every sunrise is a small victory against the forces trying to kill you. The first thing you notice is the cold. It's October, and the pre-dawn air bites at your skin like a living thing. There's no central heating, no electric blankets, no thermostat set to a comfortable 72 degrees. There's just the lingering warmth from yesterday's fire, if you're lucky, and the knowledge that the first task of every day is to coax life back into dying embers before your fingers go numb. Thomas wakes not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of roosters crowing from various corners of the village. It's still dark outside. That deep, impenetrable darkness that only exists far from city lights. The village of Little Wickham has perhaps 150 souls, spread across maybe 30 households. The manor house sits on the hill, visible even in the darkness because it's the only building with glass windows that catch and reflect the faintest starlight. Below it, scattered in no particular pattern, are the cottages of the villeins, the free peasants, the craftsmen, and the priest. The air is thick with wood smoke, a constant haze that hangs over the village like a low-lying cloud. Every household burns whatever wood they can find or afford, and the smoke mingles with the scent of animals, human waste, and the earthy smell of thatch roofs that have been dampened by the morning dew. It's not unpleasant, exactly, but it's foreign to modern senses. It's the smell of a world where nothing is wasted, where every scrap of organic matter serves a purpose, where the line between human and animal habitation is blurred by necessity. Thomas shares his 1-room cottage with Agnes, their 2 children, a pig, several chickens, and whatever rats and mice have made themselves at home in the walls. The cottage itself is what they call wattle and daub construction. Picture a wooden framework filled in with woven branches and then plastered over with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. The roof is thatched with straw, and while it keeps out most of the rain, it's also home to countless insects, spiders, and small animals. The floor is packed earth, covered with rushes that are changed when they become too foul to bear. Thomas sleeps on what passes for a mattress, a canvas sack stuffed with straw. He shares it with Agnes, and they're both fully clothed because undressing for sleep is a luxury they can't afford. The children sleep on smaller sacks nearby, and they're all covered with rough woolen blankets that smell of smoke and body odor. These blankets are precious. They represent weeks of work, from shearing the sheep to spinning the wool to weaving the cloth. They're never washed, not in the way we understand washing. Water is precious, soap is expensive, and the labor required to heat enough water to clean large items is beyond what most families can spare. The medieval concept of cleanliness is fascinating and alien to us. They weren't dirty because they were ignorant or lazy. They were dirty because being clean in our sense was literally impossible. Clean meant something different. It meant your clothes weren't obviously soiled, your hair wasn't matted with filth, and you didn't reek so badly that even your neighbors complained. It meant you washed your face and hands when you could, and you changed your linen undergarments perhaps once a week, if you were fortunate enough to own more than one set. Thomas wakes to the sound of Agnes stirring beside him. She's already been awake for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the village coming to life. The roosters have been joined by the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, and the distant sound of someone chopping wood. These are the sounds of survival, the daily symphony that means the village has made it through another night. The first task is always the fire. Without fire, there is no warmth, no cooked food, no light after darkness falls. Thomas rolls out of bed, and his feet hit the cold earth floor. The cottage is barely above freezing, and his breath mists in the air. He can hear the pig snuffling in the corner, and he knows that in a few minutes, he'll need to let it out to root around in the village streets, where it will compete with the pigs from other households for scraps and garbage. The hearth is the center of the cottage, a simple stone structure with a hole in the roof above it to let out the smoke. Sometimes the smoke goes up through the hole. Sometimes it doesn't, and the cottage fills with a choking haze that makes your eyes water and your throat burn. There's no chimney, no flue, no sophisticated ventilation system, just a hole in the roof and hope that the wind is blowing the right direction. Thomas kneels by the hearth and blows gently on the embers that Agnes banked the night before. This is skilled work. Too little air and the embers die. Too much and they flare up and consume the precious tinder without catching the kindling. He adds small twigs, then larger ones, building the fire carefully and methodically. The wood crackles and pops, and gradually the cottage begins to warm. The smoke curls up toward the roof hole, and for now, the wind is cooperative. Agnes is already moving, preparing what passes for breakfast. The family's food stores are kept in wooden chests and ceramic pots, protected as much as possible from the rats and mice that consider the cottage their home as much as the humans do. The main staple is pottage, a thick porridge made from whatever grains are available. Today, it's barley mixed with leeks and a few herbs. It's filling, nutritious enough to keep you alive, and it can be stretched with water when times are lean. But even this simple meal comes with risks that would terrify us today. The grain might be contaminated with ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains in damp conditions. Ergot poisoning causes hallucinations, convulsions, and often death. Medieval people called it St. Anthony's fire, and they recognized it as a divine punishment for sin. They had no idea that the very bread they depended on for survival could kill them. The bread Agnes bakes is dark, heavy, and often gritty with bits of stone from the quern where the grain was ground. It's made primarily from rye, which is hardier than wheat and grows better in the marginal soils that most peasants have access to. But rye is also more susceptible to ergot contamination. Every bite of bread is a small gamble with death. The family's drink is ale, a weak beer with just enough alcohol to kill the bacteria that make water dangerous. The water in the village well is contaminated with runoff from the animal pens, human waste, and whatever else finds its way into the groundwater. They don't understand the concept of bacteria, but they know that people who drink water often get sick and die, while people who drink ale generally don't. So everyone, including the children, drinks ale from morning until night. After breakfast, Thomas has a choice to make. Today is a work day on the Lord's domain, the part of the manor that belongs directly to the Lord, rather than being divided into strips for the villains to work. As a villain, Thomas owes the Lord a certain number of days of work each week. It's called week work, and it's not optional. In addition to week work, there's boon work, extra days required during planting and harvest. And there are the various other obligations that can be called in at any time, helping to repair the Lord's buildings, providing transport for the Lord's goods, or contributing to the Lord's hunting parties. Thomas's own land consists of about 30 acres scattered in narrow strips across the 3 great fields that surround the village. These strips are rarely contiguous. His holdings might include a strip in the north field, another in the south field, and a third in the east field. This scattered system is inefficient, but it's also a form of insurance. If one field suffers from flooding or drought or pest damage, the others might survive. But today, Thomas's own land will have to wait. The Lord's wheat needs to be harvested, and the weather has been threatening rain for days. If the crop is lost, everyone in the village will suffer. The Lord will have less grain to sell, which means less money to maintain the manor, which means less work for the craftsmen and less charity for the poor. The medieval economy is a delicate web, and a bad harvest can trigger a cascade of consequences that affects everyone. Thomas takes his sickle from its place on the wall and checks its edge. The blade is iron, precious, and carefully maintained. Iron is expensive, and a good sickle represents a significant investment. The handle is smooth from years of use, worn to fit Thomas's hand perfectly. This tool is literally the difference between life and death. Without it, Thomas cannot harvest grain. Without grain, Thomas cannot eat. And the walk to the Lord's domain takes Thomas past the other cottages in the village. He exchanges greetings with his neighbors, brief nods, and words that acknowledge their shared situation. Everyone is heading to the fields, carrying their tools, preparing for another day of back-breaking labor. The children who are old enough to work come too. There's no concept of childhood as we understand it. Children are small adults, expected to contribute to the family's survival as soon as they're physically able. The fields stretch out in all directions, broken up by hedgerows and stone walls that mark the boundaries between different holdings. The landscape is entirely man-made, shaped by centuries of human labor. Every tree has been planted or preserved for a purpose. Every field has been cleared stone by stone. Every hedge serves as a windbreak, a boundary marker, and a source of fuel and building materials. The wheat in the Lord's field is ripe and ready for harvest. The stalks are golden in the early morning light, heavy with grain that will feed the village through the winter. But getting the grain from the field to the table requires an enormous amount of labor. The wheat must be cut with sickles, gathered into sheaves, loaded onto carts, transported to the threshing floor, beaten with flails to separate the grain from the chaff, winnowed to remove the debris, and then stored in bags or bins. Thomas begins cutting, working his way methodically across the field. The sickle bites into the stalks with a soft whisper, and the wheat falls in neat rows behind him. His back begins to ache within the first hour, but he pushes through the pain. There's no choice. The work must be done, and there's no one else to do it. As the sun climbs higher, Thomas begins to sweat despite the cool air. The physical demands of medieval agriculture are staggering. Modern studies estimate that medieval peasants expended between 3,000 and 4,000 calories per day during harvest season. But their caloric intake was rarely more than 2,500 calories, and often much less. They were literally burning their own bodies to survive, consuming muscle and fat to provide the energy needed for the work that would, theoretically, provide them with food. The tools they used were heavy and inefficient by modern standards. The plow was a massive wooden implement that required a team of oxen to pull and several men to guide. The flail was a wooden handle connected to a shorter wooden club by a leather thong. Threshing grain meant swinging this implement over your head for hours, bringing it down on the wheat stalks with enough force to break the grain loose from the chaff. The sickle was sharp but small, requiring the harvester to bend over and cut each stalk individually. By mid-morning, Thomas's hands are cramped around the sickle handle and his back is screaming with pain. But he's not alone. The entire village is working the Lord's fields today, and there's a camaraderie and shared suffering. The women and children follow behind the men, gathering the cut wheat into bundles and loading them onto carts. The older children mind the younger ones, feeding them and keeping them out of the way of the workers. Dance. The rhythm of the work is hypnotic. Cut, gather, bundle, load, cut, gather, bundle, load. The sun moves across the sky, and the field slowly transforms from golden wheat to stubble. Thomas's world has shrunk to the next row, the next armload of grain, the next bundle to be tied and loaded. Around noon, the workers pause for their main meal of the day. Agnes has brought Thomas a wooden bowl of pottage, thick with barley and vegetables from their own small garden. There's also a chunk of bread, hard and dark, and a clay jug of ale. The food is simple but nourishing, and Thomas eats hungrily, knowing that it will have to sustain him through the afternoon's work. As he eats, Thomas surveys the field. They've made good progress, but there's still a long way to go. The weather is holding, but clouds are building on the horizon, and everyone knows that rain could ruin everything. Wet grain is difficult to harvest and prone to spoilage. If the weather turns, they'll have to work through the rain or risk losing the crop entirely. The afternoon brings its own challenges. The sun is higher now, and despite the cool air, the work is heating up. Thomas's clothes are soaked with sweat, and his hands are blistered from the sickle handle. His back aches constantly, and every movement sends shafts of pain through his shoulders and neck. But he continues cutting, because stopping is not an option. Dent. The medieval agricultural calendar was relentless. Spring brought plowing, a back-breaking task that involved breaking up the soil with a heavy wooden plow pulled by oxen. The oxen were expensive to maintain and difficult to control, and the plow itself was a massive implement that required skill and strength to operate. If the plowing wasn't done properly, the crop would fail. Summer brought haymaking, another race against time and weather. The hay had to be cut, dried, and stored before the rains came. Without hay, the animals would starve during the winter. Without animals, there would be no milk, no eggs, no meat, and no help with the heavy work of agriculture. Autumn brought the harvest, the culmination of the year's work. Everything depended on bringing in the grain before the weather turned. A successful harvest meant survival through the winter. A failed harvest meant starvation. Winter brought its own challenges. The fields needed to be prepared for the next year's planting. Tools had to be repaired and replaced. Animals had to be fed and sheltered. And there was the constant battle against cold and hunger that would continue until spring. But the medieval period was also experiencing what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that lasted from roughly 1300 to 1850. Temperatures dropped by as much as 2 degrees Celsius, which might not sound like much, but it was enough to shorten growing seasons, reduce crop yields, and make life even more precarious for people who were already living on the edge of survival. The years 1315 to 1317 were particularly brutal. A series of cold, wet summers caused crops to fail across northern Europe. The result was a famine that killed millions of people. In England, the price of wheat increased by more than 300%. People ate grass, bark, and even human flesh to survive. Entire villages were abandoned as the population died or fled in search of food. Thomas was born just after the Great Famine, but its effects lingered for decades. The population of his village was smaller than it had been in his grandfather's time. The abandoned cottages and empty fields were constant reminders of what could happen when the delicate balance between human needs and environmental resources was disrupted. As the afternoon wears on, Thomas's energy begins to flag. His movements become slower and more deliberate. The sickle feels heavier in his hands, and the simple act of bending over to cut the wheat becomes increasingly difficult. But he pushes on because the alternative is unthinkable. The diet of a medieval peasant was nutritionally inadequate by modern standards. The average person consumed between 1,500 and 2,500 calories per day, but the quality of those calories was poor. The diet was heavy on grains and light on protein, fats, and vitamins. Fresh meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions. Most protein came from dairy products, eggs, and the occasional salted fish. Vegetables were limited to what could be grown in the family's small garden plot. Cabbage, leeks, onions, and turnips were common, but they were often preserved in salt or dried for winter storage, which reduced their nutritional value. Fresh fruit was available only during the brief harvest season, and it was often too expensive for peasants to afford. The result was a population that was chronically malnourished. Vitamin deficiencies were common, leading to diseases like scurvy, rickets, and night blindness. The lack of protein meant that people were smaller and weaker than their modern counterparts. The lack of calcium meant that bones were brittle and prone to fracture. The lack of iron meant that anemia was widespread, causing fatigue, weakness, and susceptibility to disease. Thomas himself shows the signs of chronic malnutrition. He's shorter than the average modern man, with a wiry build that reflects a lifetime of hard work and inadequate nutrition. His teeth are yellowed and worn, with several missing from decay and injury. His hands are gnarled and scarred from years of manual labor. He looks older than his 28 years, weathered by exposure and hardship. Yeah, but Thomas is lucky in one respect. He survived to adulthood, which was no small achievement in the medieval world. Infant mortality was staggering, with as many as 30% of children dying before their first birthday. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents, claimed many more before they reached adulthood. Those who survived were the lucky ones, the genetic lottery winners who had the combination of physical resilience and environmental advantages needed to make it through the gauntlet of medieval childhood. As evening approaches, Thomas and his fellow workers begin to gather their tools. The day's work is done, but the harvest is far from over. Tomorrow they'll be back in the fields, and the day after that, and the day after that, until every grain of wheat is safely stored away for the winter. The walk back to the village is quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. The setting sun paints the sky in shades of red and gold, and the air is beginning to cool. Thomas's body aches from the day's work, but there's also a sense of accomplishment. Another day's survival, another step closer to making it through the winter. But survival in the medieval world required more than just growing food. It required navigating a complex web of social, legal, and economic relationships that could mean the difference between life and death. Thomas lives in a world where every aspect of life is regulated by custom, law, and the arbitrary will of those in power. The health and hygiene challenges of medieval life were staggering by modern standards. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people did bathe, but not in the way we understand bathing. They practiced what were called sweat baths, essentially medieval saunas where people would sit in heated rooms and sweat out the dirt and grime. They also washed their faces and hands regularly, and they understood the importance of keeping their clothes as clean as possible. But the reality was that true cleanliness was impossible. Soap was expensive and difficult to make. Hot water required fuel and time to heat. Clothes were washed infrequently because the process was labor-intensive and hard on the fabric. People lived in close quarters with animals, and they worked in fields and workshops that were dirty and dusty. The result was a population that was constantly battling lice, fleas, and other parasites. Intestinal worms were common, transmitted through contaminated food and water. Skin infections were widespread, caused by poor hygiene and the constant irritation of rough clothing. Dental problems were universal, caused by a diet high in coarse grains and a lack of understanding about oral hygiene. And when people got sick, their options were limited. Each village had its wise woman, an elderly female who knew the traditional remedies for common ailments. She might prescribe herbal teas for fever, poultices for wounds, or charms and prayers for more serious conditions. For more serious medical problems, there might be a barber surgeon in the nearest town, someone who could set bones, pull teeth, and perform basic surgery. AIDS. But much of medieval medicine was based on superstition and misunderstanding. The dominant medical theory was based on the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these humors, and treatment involved trying to restore the balance through bleeding, purging, or other means. Bloodletting was a common treatment for almost any ailment. The theory was that excess blood was causing the problem, and removing some of it would restore the patient's health. The practice was usually performed by applying leeches to the patient's skin, or by making small cuts and allowing the blood to drain out. Sometimes it might have helped, by chance, but more often it weakened patients who were already struggling to survive. The legal system that governed Thomas's life was equally harsh and arbitrary. The manor court met once a month to deal with disputes and crimes within the village. The lord or his steward presided, and the decisions were final. There was no appeal, no higher court to turn to, no concept of due process as we understand it. Says, common crimes included theft of wood from the lord's forest, poaching deer or other game, failure to perform required work, and disputes over land boundaries. The punishments were swift and often brutal. A thief might be placed in the stocks for a day, exposed to the ridicule and abuse of his neighbors. A poacher might have his ears cropped, marking him permanently as a criminal. A repeat offender might be hanged. The frank pledge system meant that every man in the village was responsible for the behavior of his neighbors. Groups of 10 men, called tithings, were collectively responsible for ensuring that their members obeyed the law. If one man committed a crime and fled, the other 9 were required to pay his fine or face punishment themselves. This system created a web of mutual surveillance and control that made it difficult for anyone to step outside the bounds of acceptable behavior. Thomas belongs to a tithing with 9 other men from the village. They meet regularly to discuss any problems or concerns, and they're expected to report any suspicious behavior to the manor court. It's a system that maintains order. but it also stifles individual freedom and initiative. The role of the church in medieval life cannot be overstated. The bells of the parish church mark the hours of the day, calling the faithful to prayer at dawn, noon, and dusk. The church calendar determines when people work and when they rest, when they feast and when they fast. The priest is one of the few literate people in the village, and he serves as a link between the illiterate peasants and the wider world of learning and authority. But the church also preaches a message that can be terrifying in its intensity. The medieval Christian worldview was dominated by the concept of sin and the certainty of divine punishment. Life on earth was seen as a brief and painful prelude to eternity, and that eternity would be spent either in the unimaginable bliss of heaven or the unimaginable torment of hell. The choice between these two fates depended on how well you followed the church's teachings and how successfully you avoided the snares of sin. The sermons that Thomas hears every Sunday are filled with graphic descriptions of hellfire and damnation. The priest describes in vivid detail the torments that await the unrepentant sinner: burning in lakes of fire, being devoured by demons, suffering pain beyond human comprehension for all eternity. These images are not metaphorical. They are presented as literal descriptions of what happens to people who die in a state of sin. But alongside this terrifying message, the church also offers hope. The saints are presented as powerful protectors who can intercede with God on behalf of the faithful. Each saint has his or her own specialty. Saint Apollonia protects against toothache. Saint Vitus protects against dancing mania. Saint Christopher protects travelers. Saint Sebastian protects against plague. The Virgin Mary is the most powerful of all, able to intercede even for the most desperate sinner. Hence, the result is a religious worldview that combines profound fear with desperate hope. People pray constantly, not just at church services, but throughout the day. They carry religious relics and wear religious symbols. They make pilgrimages to holy sites, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles on foot to visit the shrine of a particular saint. They give money to the church that they can ill afford, hoping to purchase prayers that will reduce their time in purgatory. But this same religious worldview also provides a framework for understanding suffering and hardship. The medieval peasant doesn't expect life to be easy or pleasant. He expects it to be a test, a trial that must be endured with patience and faith. The poverty, the hunger, the disease, the constant threat of death. These are not accidents or injustices. They're part of God's plan, opportunities to prove one's faith and earn salvation. As darkness falls, Thomas makes his way to the village alehouse. This is not a place of drunkenness and debauchery, despite what popular culture might suggest. It's a social center, a place where people gather to share news, tell stories, and maintain the bonds of community that are essential for survival. The ale served in the alehouse is weak, with an alcohol content of perhaps 2 or 3%. It's not strong enough to make people drunk, but it's strong enough to kill the bacteria that make water dangerous to drink. The alehouse keeper, usually a woman, brews the ale in her own cottage and serves it in wooden cups or ceramic mugs. There might be simple food available: bread, cheese, perhaps some salted fish or meat. The conversation in the alehouse is the medieval equivalent of television and social media combined. People share news from other villages, carried by traveling merchants or wandering laborers. They discuss the weather, the crops, the decisions of the manor court, and the behavior of their neighbors. They tell stories, both true and fictional, that serve to entertain and educate. During the long winter months, the alehouse becomes a center for more elaborate entertainment. Traveling minstrels might perform songs and stories. Local people might organize Morris dancing, a form of folk dance that involves elaborate costumes and choreographed movements. There might be mystery plays, religious dramas that tell stories from the Bible or the lives of the saints. The oral tradition is still strong in Thomas's world. Most people cannot read or write, so information is transmitted through speech and memory. The stories told in the alehouse serve multiple functions. They preserve history, teach moral lessons, and provide entertainment. They also serve as a form of social control, reinforcing the values and norms of the community. The gossip that circulates in the alehouse is not just idle chatter. It's a form of social regulation that helps maintain order and cohesion. People who violate community standards find themselves the subject of unfavorable gossip, which can damage their reputation and make it difficult for them to function in village society. People who conform to community expectations are praised and held up as examples for others to follow. But But the alehouse is also a place where the rigid social hierarchies of medieval society can be temporarily relaxed. The lord of the manor doesn't drink with the peasants, but within the peasant community there's a certain equality. The successful farmer drinks alongside the struggling cottager. The skilled craftsman shares a table with the landless laborer. The barriers of wealth and status are still there, but they're less visible in the warm, smoky atmosphere of the alehouse. As the evening progresses, Thomas begins to feel the effects of the day's work. His muscles ache, his hands are stiff, and his eyes are heavy with exhaustion. But he's reluctant to leave the warmth and companionship of the alehouse. At home, there's only the cold cottage, the hard bed, and the knowledge that tomorrow will bring another day of back-breaking labor. When Thomas finally makes his way home, the village is settling into its nighttime rhythm. The streets are dark, lit only by the occasional rushlight flickering through a window. The darkness is complete in a way that modern people can barely imagine. There are no streetlights, no electric signs, no cars with headlights. The only light comes from the moon and stars, and on cloudy nights, even that is absent. The cottage is warm from the fire that Agnes has kept burning, but the warmth doesn't extend far beyond the hearth. The walls are thin, and the door is little more than a few planks of wood held together with iron straps. The windows are small openings covered with oiled cloth, or if the family is prosperous, with horns scraped thin enough to let in light. Glass is a luxury that peasants can't afford. Thomas bars the door with a heavy wooden beam, a precaution that's both practical and psychological. The medieval countryside is not a safe place after dark. There are wolves in the forests, though they rarely venture into the village. There are bandits and outlaws who might see a cottage as an easy target. There are also the more mundane dangers of accident and injury in the darkness. But the real danger is fire. The cottage is made of wood, straw, and other combustible materials. The fire in the hearth is essential for warmth and cooking, but it's also a constant threat. A spark that lands on the straw roof, a log that rolls out of the fireplace, a candle that's knocked over. Any of these could start a fire that would consume the cottage and everything in it within minutes. Thomas and Agnes practice what historians call the two-sleep pattern, a sleep schedule that was common throughout the medieval period. They go to bed shortly after sunset, sleep for 4 or 5 hours, then wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night. During this waking period, they might tend the fire, check on the animals, or simply lie in bed and talk. Then they go back to sleep until dawn. This pattern might seem strange to modern people, but it was perfectly natural in a world without electric lighting. The long winter nights were too long to sleep through in one stretch, and the brief waking period in the middle of the night served several practical purposes. It was a time to ensure that the fire hadn't gone out, to check that the animals were safe, and to listen for any sounds that might indicate danger. The cottage is never completely quiet. The animals make noise throughout the night, the pigs snuffling in its corner, the chickens clucking softly on their roosts, the rats and mice scurrying in the walls. Outside, there are the sounds of the village, dogs barking, cats fighting, the occasional human voice calling out. And beyond the village, there are the sounds of the countryside, owls hooting, wolves howling in the distance, the wind rustling through the trees. Thomas lies in bed, his body aching from the day's work, his mind already turning to the tasks that await him tomorrow. The harvest must continue, and there are his own fields to tend as well. The strips of land that provide his family's livelihood need attention, and the weather won't wait for his convenience. He thinks about the winter ahead, the long months when there will be little work in the fields but plenty of other tasks to occupy his time. There are tools to repair, animals to tend, and the constant battle against cold and hunger. The family's food stores are adequate for now, but they must be carefully managed to last until the next harvest. Agnes lies beside him, her breathing soft and regular. She's already asleep, exhausted by her own day of labor. She's been working since before dawn, preparing food, tending the animals, helping with the harvest, and managing the countless small tasks that keep a medieval household functioning. Her work is no less demanding than Thomas's, and in many ways, it's more complex and varied. The children sleep nearby, their small bodies curled up under their blankets. They're both healthy for now, but Thomas knows how quickly that can change. Disease can strike without warning, and even a simple illness can be fatal in a world without modern medicine. Every parent in the village has lost children, and every child who survives to adulthood is a small miracle. Thomas closes his eyes and tries to sleep, but his mind is still active. He thinks about the day's work, the progress they made in the harvest, the weather signs that suggest rain might be coming. He thinks about his obligations to the Lord, the work he owes on the domain, the various fees and fines that must be paid. He thinks about his own strips of land, the crops that are his family's lifeline, the careful balance between survival and disaster. In the distance, the church bell tolls the hour, a sound that carries across the sleeping village. It's a reminder of the order that governs their lives, the rhythm of prayer and work that structures their days. Thomas mutters a brief prayer, asking for protection through the night and strength for the day ahead. The fire in the hearth settles with a soft crackle, and the cottage grows gradually colder. Thomas pulls his blanket tighter around his shoulders and shifts position on the straw mattress. Tomorrow will bring another day of back-breaking labor, another day of the endless struggle to survive in a world that seems designed to kill anyone who isn't strong enough, smart enough, or lucky enough to fight back. But tonight, Thomas is alive. His family is alive. They have food for today and hope for tomorrow. In the medieval world, that's about as much as anyone can ask for. The modern comforts we take for granted, the safety and security we assume as our birthright, the abundance of food and shelter and medical care that surrounds us, these would seem like miracles to Thomas and his contemporaries. Yeah. As you lie in your warm bed listening to this story, you're experiencing a level of comfort and security that medieval people could barely imagine. Your mattress is soft and clean. Your blankets are warm and free of vermin. Your house is heated and cooled to maintain a comfortable temperature. Your food is safe and nutritious. Your water is clean and abundant. Your medical care is sophisticated and effective. Yet, the distance between Thomas's world and yours is not just a matter of time. It's a matter of survival itself. The daily struggle that defined every moment of Thomas's existence has been replaced for most of us by concerns that would have seemed impossibly luxurious to a medieval peasant. We worry about our Wi-Fi connection, our commute to work, our entertainment options. Thomas worried about whether his family would live to see another sunrise. The gap between medieval and modern mortality rates tells the story in stark numbers. In Thomas's time, life expectancy at birth was perhaps 30 years, and that figure is misleading because it's heavily skewed by infant mortality. If you survive to age 20, you might live to see 45 or 50. If you survive to age 40, you might live to see 60. But survival itself was a constant battle against forces that most of us never even think about. Consider something as simple as a cut finger. For you, it's a minor inconvenience. You clean the wound, apply a bandage, and forget about it. For Thomas, that same cut could be a death sentence. Without antiseptics, without antibiotics, without any understanding of bacterial infection, even minor wounds could become infected and lead to blood poisoning, gangrene, or death. A broken bone was often a permanent disability. There were no x-rays to show how the bone was healing, no surgery to repair complex fractures, no physical therapy to restore function. People learned to live with crooked arms and legs, with limited mobility, with constant pain. A serious injury to a working-age adult could doom an entire family to poverty and starvation. Childbirth was a life-or-death gamble for both mother and child. Perhaps one woman in 50 died in childbirth, and the infant mortality rate was staggering. Agnes has given birth to 5 children, and 3 of them died before their second birthday. This wasn't unusual. This was normal. Every family expected to lose children, and parents learned to temper their emotional attachment to babies and toddlers who might not survive. The diseases that killed medieval people were often diseases that we've forgotten about entirely. Ergotism, caused by eating contaminated grain, could cause convulsions, hallucinations, and death. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, could cause teeth to fall out, wounds to refuse to heal, and eventually death. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, could cause bones to become soft and deformed. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval mortality was its unpredictability. The Black Death, which would arrive in England just a few years after our imagined day in 1347, would kill between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population. Entire villages would be wiped out. Families would be destroyed. The social and economic structures that had taken centuries to develop would collapse almost overnight. Even without major epidemics, death was a constant presence in medieval life. People died from diseases that we can now cure with a simple course of antibiotics. They died from accidents that modern safety equipment would prevent. They died from malnutrition in years when the harvest failed. They died from exposure during harsh winters. They died from violence that better law enforcement might have prevented. But perhaps most importantly, they died from the cumulative effect of a lifetime of physical stress, inadequate nutrition, and constant exposure to disease and danger. The human body can endure tremendous hardship, but it cannot endure it indefinitely. The medieval peasant's body was worn out by age 40, if he was lucky enough to live that long. Thomas's aching muscles, his scarred hands, his worn teeth, his weather-beaten skin, these are the signs of a life spent fighting for survival. Every day of his existence has required physical effort that would exhaust most modern people. Every calorie he consumes has been earned through back-breaking labor. Every possession he owns has been acquired through careful saving and sacrifice. The mental and emotional toll of medieval life was equally severe. The constant uncertainty, the knowledge that disaster could strike at any moment, the loss of children and loved ones, the grinding poverty and endless labor, all of these created a psychological burden that we can barely imagine. Yet medieval people developed coping mechanisms that helped them endure. The strong sense of community provided mutual support in times of crisis. The religious faith that promised reward in the afterlife made earthly suffering bearable. The acceptance of hardship as the natural human condition prevented the kind of existential despair that might overwhelm someone with modern expectations. The stories told in the alehouse, the festivals and celebrations that marked the passage of seasons, the rituals and traditions that gave meaning to daily life, all of these served to make survival not just possible, but worthwhile. Even in the midst of hardship, there was joy to be found in simple pleasures. A good harvest, a successful birth, a wedding celebration, a religious festival. The medieval world was not entirely grim. There was laughter in the alehouse, dancing at festivals, courtship and romance, pride in skilled work, satisfaction in a job well done. But these moments of joy were precious precisely because they were rare and fragile, constantly threatened by the harsh realities of medieval existence. As Thomas finally drifts off to sleep, his breathing gradually deepening and slowing, the cottage settles into the quiet rhythm of the night. The fire burns lower, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The animals shift and settle in their corners. The village around them sleeps, exhausted by another day of survival. In a few hours, Thomas will wake again for his middle-of-the-night vigil. He'll check the fire, listen to the sounds of the night, perhaps exchange a few quiet words with Agnes. Then he'll sleep again until dawn, when the cycle will begin anew. Tomorrow will bring more back-breaking labor in the fields. There will be more grain to harvest, more sheaves to bundle, more carts to load. The weather will hold, or it won't. The harvest will be successful, or it will fail. Thomas and his family will survive another day, or they won't. The uncertainty is constant, but so is the determination to continue. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of giving up. They couldn't retreat to a comfortable modern life when things got difficult. They had to keep fighting, keep working, keep hoping, because the alternative was death. And so Thomas sleeps, his body recovering from the day's exertions, his mind already preparing for tomorrow's challenges. He dreams, perhaps, of better times, a successful harvest, a warm winter, children who live to adulthood, a life without constant struggle. Or perhaps he dreams of nothing at all, his exhausted mind simply shutting down to conserve energy for the battles ahead. The church bell tolls again in the distance, marking another hour of the night. The sound echoes across the sleeping village, a reminder of the rhythms that govern medieval life. Dawn will come, as it always does, bringing new challenges and new opportunities for survival. For now, though, there is rest. The cottage is warm, the family is safe, the day's work is done. In the medieval world, that's about as much peace as anyone can expect. The modern listener, safe in their comfortable bed, might find it hard to imagine how precious such simple comfort would seem to someone like Thomas. Your soft mattress, your warm blankets, your heated room, your sense of security and safety, these are luxuries beyond anything Thomas could imagine. The knowledge that you will wake up tomorrow, that food will be available, that medical care is accessible, that your children are safe, that your home is secure, these certainties that you take for granted would seem like miracles to a medieval peasant. The distance between Thomas's world and yours is measured not just in centuries, but in the countless human innovations and social developments that have made survival easier and more certain. The agricultural revolution that increased food production, the medical revolution that conquered disease, the industrial revolution that made labor more efficient, the social revolution that created safety nets for the vulnerable. Yet, each of these developments built upon the others, creating a cascade of improvements that gradually transformed human existence from a daily struggle for survival into something approaching security and comfort. The process was slow and often painful, but it was inexorable. Thomas and his contemporaries lived on the knife's edge of existence, always one bad harvest, one serious illness, one natural disaster away from catastrophe. You live in a world where such disasters, while still possible, are buffered by insurance, government assistance, medical intervention, and 1,000 other safety nets that make survival more likely and suffering less severe. The medieval peasant's greatest achievement was simply staying alive long enough to reproduce and raise children who might, in turn, survive long enough to continue the cycle. Your greatest challenges are of an entirely different order. Finding meaning and purpose in a life where survival is largely guaranteed, managing abundance rather than scarcity, dealing with the psychological and social challenges of a complex modern world. As the night deepens and the cottage grows colder, Thomas sleeps the sleep of the physically exhausted. His body repairs itself as best it can, preparing for another day of labor. His mind processes the day's experiences, filing away lessons learned and challenges met. The fire burns lower, the embers glowing softly in the darkness. The animal settles into their own rhythms of rest. The village sleeps, hundreds of people all facing the same challenges, all fighting the same battles, all hoping for the same simple goal: to survive another day. In the distance, barely audible, the church bell strikes midnight. The sound carries across the sleeping countryside, a reminder that time passes, that seasons change, that life continues its ancient rhythm of struggle and survival. Thomas sleeps on, unaware of the bell, unaware of the passing hours, unaware of the centuries that separate his world from yours. He dreams, perhaps, of spring plowing, of summer haymaking, of autumn harvest, of winter survival. Or perhaps he dreams of nothing at all, his exhausted mind simply resting, gathering strength for the challenges ahead. The medieval world was harsh, but it was also resilient. People like Thomas endured unimaginable hardships and somehow found ways to continue, to build families, to create communities, to pass on their knowledge and traditions to the next generation. Their struggles laid the foundation for everything that came after, including the comfortable modern world that allows you to listen to their story from the safety of your warm bed. So sleep well, modern listener. Sleep secure in the knowledge that your ancestors fought and died to give you the luxury of safety, comfort, and peace. Sleep grateful for the countless innovations and developments that have made your life easier than Thomas could ever imagine. Sleep thankful for the warm bed, the clean water, the abundant food, the medical care, the safety and security that surround you. And remember, as you drift off to sleep, that every comfort you enjoy was built on the sacrifices of countless people like Thomas, who lived and died in the endless struggle to survive, to improve, to leave something better for their children. Their legacy is the world you inhabit, a world where survival is not a daily battle but a reasonable expectation, where comfort is not a luxury but a common experience, where the future holds promise rather than merely the hope of seeing another sunrise. The church bell tolls one final time, its sound fading into the darkness, carrying with it the echoes of a world that was, and the promise of the world that was to come.